Okay, can everybody see me? Good. This looks pretty good. Alright, I have here the plot line for Macbeth before I start my presentation. I figure it's somewhat important that we know what the play is about in a simple form. Essentially, it's about a man who becomes king by killing the king. He was told that this would happen. He was told that he would become king by three witches, and then he fulfills that prophecy after his wife, Lady Macbeth, tells him to kill the king. After he becomes king, though, he's haunted by this guilt and becomes increasingly more and more evil. But he eventually kills his own friend, Banquo. And finally, at the end of the play, he's killed by Macduff. Now, also before starting the presentation, I think it's important that we see the scene in which my play is about, okay? And in the middle of the play, there's this knocking that Macbeth hears. This knocking begins to kind of drive Macbeth insane because it's like the guilt bothering him. It's sort of like a good metaphor for the guilt. The knocking that he hears at the gate is reminding him that he did something wrong. Okay, so I will go to 3 here.
Fierce painted devil! If he do bleed, I'll gild the faces of the grooms withal, for it must seem their guilt.
That's when he begins to hear it.
Whence is that knocking? How is it with me when every noise appalls me?
So he says, every noise appalls him.
They pluck out mine eyes. To know my deed were best not know myself. Wait, Duncan, with thy knocking. I would thou couldst.
Okay, so several notable quotes there. First, he says he's bothered by every noise that he ever hears. This becomes relevant because later on I'm going to talk a little bit about how devils in the old pageant plays were bothered by the noises that they would hear at the gate. Also, wink, dunking with your knocking, I wish you could. In the old pageant plays, Jesus Christ would come to the gates of hell, and he would knock on the gates of hell, and he would release souls. And that knocking would bother the devils because they knew they would lose. Now, the next scene we have here is a porter. Now, porters are people who by the gate, right? And he's obviously drunk. He was given stuff to drink by Lady Macbeth, and he begins to hear the knocking in this next scene.
From a porter of her gate, he'd have all turning up the key. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? There'll never be Elsie-Bob.
So it's kind of hard to tell with the Shakespearean English, but he's imitating a devil.
He's a farmer who had himself an expectation of plenty. How in time server have napkins enough about you? No, never that quite. What are you? But it's too cold here for hell.
Okay.
No further.
So he says it's too cold in here and he won't pretend to be a devil's porter anymore. So he's at the gate, pretending to be a devil while he's drunk and he hears a knocking. The title of my presentation is The Sound of Hellmouth in Shakespeare. It is a summary and reflection on Kurt Schreier's article, Here's a Knocking Indeed, Macbeth and the Harrowing of Hell. So we've already talked a bit about pageant plays. In the old pageant plays, they would depict biblical scenes or theological scenes where they would talk about or show theological principles. For example, you have the crucifixion of Christ, you name it. Pageant plays were the number one or one of the best ways to depict these sorts of themes. In Kurt Schreier's article, he's talking about that same kind of knocking, that same kind of noise that was heard in the old pageant plays. So in the old pageant plays, there would be these sorts of sets or stages, and these stages were known for the noises they would make. Two particular play scenes that were often depicted were the Herring of Hell and the Last Judgment. Kurt Schreier, in his article, he references these plays, and he also uses or points out how Shakespeare uses these references as a political commentary for his own contemporary peers. In the case of the knocking that you hear in Shakespeare, it's reminiscent of the old circle cycle plays. So in the Herring of Hell, Christ would come and he would knock on the gates of hell. And when he did this, he would tear down the gates of hell, and it would create a horrendous knocking sound. A knocking sound that would drive the devils in hell insane, just like it drove Macbeth insane. And what Christ would do is he would then take the souls, release them, and bring them into heaven. When Macbeth says that he wishes he could wake Duncan with your knocking, he is talking to God, saying that he wishes that the knocking that God is making, or the gate, or the person at the gate is making, could wake the dead. Yes, that's what he's saying. Now, this is further supported when the porter pretends to be a devil. Who would guard the gates of hell? It was usually a devil, right? And Christ would challenge them or be in conflict with them. So the devil or the porter in this scene is parodying this sort of old reference. The way this knocking sound was used in Shakespeare could be thought of as a sort of modern, or not modern, I'm sorry, a sort of theater prop. While in old stage plays they would have Hell Mouse, or in old pageant plays they'd have Hell Mouse, and they would be borrowed from one pageant play to another, here, in this new setting, Shakespeare is borrowing a sound from an older play, The Herring of Hell. A scholar that Schreier quotes, Rastall, he makes note that in the margins of a play that was found from that era, they had actual markings that showed instructions on how to recreate sounds. And one of the instructions told them to bang pots together. So even then, there was a very concrete, materialistic idea of what the sound was supposed to be for when thunder occurred. In the case of the Doomsday or the Last Judgment play, they would use a metallic drum. And this same metallic drum was actually used at the beginning of Macbeth, when the thunder appears. So the witches at the beginning of the play, when you hear the thunder, that is reminiscent of cycle plays as well. What this is telling us, though, is that this is perhaps deliberate. While the sound of knocking, in particular, could be seen as a stage prop, it was a bit more than just a stage prop. It was an actual reference. The porter, of course, is the best example of this. The second he hears the knocking, he pretends to be a devil. From this, he's playing with the audience's expectations. They expect him to be a devil because they know this sound. They also expect, at the end of the knocking, for Christ to appear. Because who comes and knocks on the gates of hell? Well, it's Christ. Also, the porter asks the audience for money. Well, the porter doesn't ask the audience for money. What he does is he asks the two Scottish lords that appear at the end of the knocking at the gate. So after the knocking's finished, two Scottish lords show up, and he asks them for money. In the old pageant plays, during the middle of a major scene, the devils would stop and ask the audience for money. So when the porter pretends to be a devil and asks the Scottish lords for money, the reference was very apparent or very clear to the audience of a medieval who remembered the late medieval plays, right? And if the porter didn't obviously reference Macbeth enough already, or I'm sorry, if the porter didn't already reference the hell motif from the cycle plays enough on his own, Macbeth also does so when he references or says that the sound is bothering him. Because in the old cycle So, because in the old cycle plays, the devils were always bothered by the sound of God approaching. They would hear the knocking and they would screech. This is a very common idea, like, what's that noise? It drives me. Like, think of the devil being bothered by the light, or a vampire being bothered by the light. That was the way the devils were bothered by the sound of knocking in these old plays. And Macbeth was beginning to be bothered by the sounding as well, showing that he was guilty, and this guilt was eating him alive. Now, I can't overemphasize how much this play is like an old pageant play, right? Because there's all these references to it. But the one thing I can say about Macbeth, though, is that it is not a pageant play. And the Trier is very adamant about this point as well. There's one tendency to think of it as though he was just recreating the pageant play with modern characters for a Reformation era. There's a problem with this. First of all, the porter denies that the place is hell. He says the place is too cold for hell. If Shakespeare was trying to show a modern day hell, he wouldn't need to have the porter distance himself from the reference by saying this place is too cold for hell. Also, the porter is merely pretending to be a devil. He says, a devil I will pretend to be no longer, or something to that effect, right? He is not the devil, he's a clown pretending to be a devil. Also, if this were a pageant play, we would see Christ come at the end of it, at the end of the knocking, and defeat evil. What happens here, though, is not that. Rather, what happens here is two Scottish lords show up at the end of the knocking. So, we can get into why the Scottish lords show up later, but the setting is not a hell setting. It is not a biblical scene. Also, keep in mind, these biblical scenes were sometimes depicted in modern settings, so the fact that Macbeth was more contemporary than biblical times doesn't make it an inadequate representation of hell. Rather, what makes it an inadequate representation of hell is the actual dialogue and the actual text of the play itself that tells us it's not hell. Also, another point is if it were hell, the sound would only bother those who were going to hell. Instead, you have people like Lennox, who's not particularly guilty, who was also bothered by the sound of hell, because he says it kept him up all night. He heard lambing screams, so multiple people heard screaming in the night when Macbeth killed Duncan. It wasn't just those who were guilty. So hell is fear for those who are guilty, but Macbeth killing Duncan is fear for everybody. This place is too cold for hell. So then the question is, why did Shakespeare show this scene? And there's probably two theories on this. The first theory is that it was a political criticism of monarchy. There are two different camps of thought, or two different train of thoughts on whether or not Macbeth is a criticism of monarchy or not. The first that think it's in praise of monarchy usually point towards the various different quotes that are in the play where the characters speak admirably about kings. For a lot of Shakespeare's contemporaries, this was the prevailing thought. Shakespeare was writing a Scottish play for a Scottish king. Most likely you would not want to criticize the king, so the play is generally interpreted to be a pro-monarchy play. But there's also what's called a resistance theory, where it's believed that underneath the sort of layers, there's an actual criticism of monarchy. And it takes a little bit of depth to look at the play as a whole to see how this could be the case, but it's there. For example, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, they achieve the throne in the most unadmirable of ways. They kill somebody. They're evil. They're evil king and queen. So if they're an evil king and queen, this is clearly a depiction of a corrupt monarchy. Also, in the end of the play, Lady Macbeth, she kills herself, but when Macbeth is defeated, he's defeated by Macduff. Macduff isn't even technically supposed to inherit the throne. If they wanted to show the monarchy prevailing, they would have shown Malcolm defeat Macbeth, but the play doesn't do this. It's a very deliberate choice, I think. And in the scene that we're talking about in question, rather than seeing Christ show up, we see two Scottish lords show up. At first thought you'd think, okay, so the Scottish lords are like Christ. They're showing up at the gates of hell, or the gates of Macbeth's castle. But on further reflection, you can also see this as a bit of irony as well. Like, they're not quite Scottish, they're not quite Christ, so it's sort of like highlighting how insignificant they are by comparison. You put a picture of me where Christ would be, I wouldn't seem so significant, I'd look kind of pathetic. So that sort of political commentary on monarchy is the first interpretation. The second theme, and probably the more prevalent one, is that Macbeth was actually a play used to criticize Shakespeare's contemporaries. At the time, the Reformation had occurred, and a lot of the cycle plays were actually outlawed. Okay, so the cycle plays, they were not being performed, but yet a lot of the people who used to perform those plays were still alive. The late medieval time period was not that long ago. So the English Reformation began 70 years before Macbeth was written, and it went back and forth between being a Catholic and a Protestant country. So the audience was familiar with Catholic plays and Catholic cycle plays, so to speak. And also at that time, there were pastors that were criticizing the theater because they thought of the theater as just a continuation of Catholic practices. And they would usually point towards the old biblical scenes or the old theological plays, the harrowing of hell and the Last Judgment, right? So what you can see here is Shakespeare is very deliberately sort of poking fun at his opponents. Schreier words it as though it were a knock-knock joke. You say knock knock, who's there? And you expect to see Christ, but instead it's two Scottish lords. This is doing two things. It's making fun of both the Scottish lords, and it's teasing with the idea of actually depicting an illegal play. So it's like, oh, it's not quite this illegal play, but it's close to it. Ha, got you fooled, got you fooled. You thought it was going to be Jesus? You thought we were going to show the harrowing of hell, but nope. It's actually just two Scottish lords. And this devil, he's not really a devil. He's just a porter pretending to be a devil. Because we would never do that. No, no, no. We would never depict anything illegal. That seems to be the sort of attitude and criticism that Macbeth or Shakespeare is using to criticize opponents of the theater. It's clever satire. Now, oftentimes with Shakespeare on a whole, whenever he quotes or references anything before him, the tendency, because there's such an admirable quality to Shakespeare, such prestige to his name, we tend to think of it as though he invented theater. So a lot of people, when they talk about theater, or when they talk about the pageant plays, in light of Shakespeare, they think of the pageant plays as if they were essentially, okay, maybe some good material, but they didn't really have meaning until Shakespeare resurrected them and put them in his plays. As though Shakespeare's plays were the best thing that ever happened to pageant plays. Schreier rejects this dry bones, that's what he calls it, dry bones, description. Like, you find bones, like there were nothing, but then you found them. Schreier rejects this idea by saying that the pageant plays had significance on their own. If you ever look at these old pageant plays, the sounds were significant and had their own meaning. And so when Shakespeare uses these same sounds, he's not recreating the sounds. Rather, the sounds are shaping his play. His play, in many senses, it's not a modern-day pageant play. It very deliberately is not that. But it undeniably was influenced by pageant plays, and it plays with this idea that there could be a pageant play. So, in conclusion, the play or the pageant plays were important for Shakespeare. They actually formed and shaped Shakespeare. Shakespeare, while he's treated as though he sometimes created theater out of nowhere, he was standing on the shoulders of giants as well. He doesn't exist in isolation. He was perhaps the most brilliant playwright that has ever lived, but even he had his sources of influences. And that is the main takeaway that Schreier is making. And he says that this knocking serves as probably the